Thank you very much. Hey, I thought I'd start by saying thank you for Dr. Reverend Lisette Wright, who invited me and challenged me to do this. I tend to be very private in my expression of my spiritual life. And so I also don't often talk about myself, and certainly not in a public forum. And so this is definitely stretching me beyond my normal behavior in the world. So so bear with me as I navigate my discomfort. I know our spiritual journeys are very intimate, private aspects of our lives, and so sometimes they're hard to talk about. And so I thought what I would talk a little bit about is how my upbringing and experience have shaped where I've gone with my my career and my life, and how they're connected to identity and worldview, sort of how I approach the world, and do ask me any questions that you want. When I sent the bio, I included the cities. If you ever get the chance, there's a really wonderful TED Talk by Tay Selassie, and she talks about the idea of where you're local as opposed to from this question of where are you from. And I've always been an outsider wherever I am because we moved so much. And so I've always gotten that question, where are you from? And that from question, now I tend to answer it, well, I teach at Berea College, right? Or I live in Berea, Kentucky. Because I don't have that place where where my parents have always lived or my grandparents have always lived, and where I can easily connect to. I grew up, there's a term that I think has kind of fallen away. We talk about it differently now, but I was what used to be called a third culture child, which means that I'm the child of either parents from different cultures, or from a culture that grows up someplace else, right? It speaks in some ways of displaced communities and communities that are coming together and finding connections beyond their sort of homogeneous base communities, right? Although my father was from New York, there's nothing homogeneous about New York City. My father is a child. My grandfather was born in the US, but his older brother by a year and a half was born in Ireland. And so on that side, very recent immigrants, and Catholic immigrants. Both of sides of my family are Catholic. On my grandmother's side, paternally, they've been here a lot longer. They've been here from middle of the 19th century, but had been orphaned. And so that created a break. And so really it's that other side of the family that's better known. My mother came to the US as a graduate student, and so she's Colombian. She came from a very devout Catholic family, and one that was particularly interested in social justice. And so I'm not sure how much you all know about liberation theology, but that was an aspect of my mother's, particularly her college career. She was very activist in that way. And in Colombia, it had a very particular manifestation, but this was an aspect of her training. And my parents actually met in the process of doing service work. My father went to Colombia after finishing his master's degree in education. He was a math teacher, and joined the Peace Corps. This is the era of the Vietnam War. And he went to Colombia for 2 years on a Peace Corps trip, and he was training teachers in Colombia on how to be better math teachers. And so my mother was training teachers in Colombia about how to be better social science teachers. And so they met doing volunteer work at actually a community of Dominican nuns had invited them both to do this kind of work. And so they met in that way. And so teaching is deeply embedded in my family history. Actually, I have 2 siblings, and we're all teachers at different institutions. My brother in the public school system in LA, and my older brother is in Texas State University, and he's a director of Southwest Studies. So he's a historian looking at Mexican-American border issues, labor, medical history. And my younger brother is now a principal of the largest public high school in the Montebello City area of Los Angeles. So when I think about being a principal of an inner city school of 2,500 students, that is pretty bold work that involves a lot of strength and vision and patience. And it turns out calling the police on occasion that he has to do in ways that I just can't imagine. But teaching and service was very core to the way my parents approached the world. And because they had these two different, both Catholic, but different cultures that they came from, when they came to New York City, my mother's master's degree was from Florida, from the University of Florida. And she loved her time in Florida, but she did not love her time in New York. And so Tay Selassie talks about the idea of localities as even nation, right? If you say you're from the United States, New York is different from Miami, is different from Santa Fe, it's right, different from Berea. And so the question of where are you local becomes a question of what is the actual community that you were raised in? And so I had the list of Addis Ababa. That's the first country outside. I'm 2 months old. We went to Ethiopia. So Addis Ababa is the capital of Ethiopia. Mexico City, Cali, Colombia. My mother was in Colombia. Tuscaloosa in Alabama. Those are the only 2 years prior to the age of 17 that I was in the US. And then Querétaro was the longest span of time that I'd been in any country, even though it wasn't either of my parents' country. And so we have that kind of connection to a culture that feels mine, but biologically is not, right? It's still Latin America, but Colombia and Mexico are very different. And so we have that experience. Graduate school was the longest I'd ever been anywhere, and that was Austin, Texas. And then by the time I got tenure, that was the longest I've ever been anywhere, right? So that sense of constantly in the move is very present. And so now when I think about where I'm local, it's New Mexico, where my mother has now lived for 35 years, but again, is not where she's from. And Berea. So those have become sort of locuses, as well as Barcelona in Spain, where I do a lot of my research. And so I have these centers that are effective. They have to do with my job, but also my friends, my family, my community within that sort of expansion of form. And so the other thing that living in essence in expat communities abroad also means that they were incredibly diverse. And so I grew up surrounded by a tremendous amount of diversity in terms of ethnicity, race, and also religion. And so while I had two very devout Catholic parents, the respect and honoring of other people's religious traditions was very core to how I was raised. And so one of my mother's dearest friends was Buddhist. She had a very, very close friend who then actually married into a Muslim family, right? So I've always had those experiences of what it means to be connected to your own, to the faith of your upbringing, but also being deeply respectful of other people's faith and their personal, but also their journeys culturally of how their nations have formed those religious connections. And in some ways that shapes the different areas I've been interested in terms of what I dedicate a ton of my time, which is research for my own research and research for my classes, right? That's a huge amount of what I do. And initially I worked with Latin America. My master's is in modern Latin America. And I was very interested in religious and political upheaval in Colombia. And it wasn't religious in the way that we think about Ireland, right? Protestants and Catholics fighting, or the Middle East, Muslims and Jews and Christians fighting. It was communities who were all identifying as Catholic who fought each other. And while they weren't fighting for a very particular ideology, there was that construction of are you following it correctly, right? It's one of those age-old wars that we see. And the conservative approach in Colombia created, at the end of the day, a dictatorship. The first one, Colombia, is unusual in that it didn't have the history of dictatorships we see in other places in Latin America. But I was interested in this moment of progressive, liberal, conservative, in ways that are very different from the US. We use the same words, but very different, having that kind of dimension. And so for my thesis as an undergraduate, I did an honors thesis looking at an artist, Alejandro Obregón, who took on, in a very visceral way, the experience of a nation undergoing a civil war, an incredibly violent, the period's actually called the violence, right? An incredibly violent era where people feel almost charged religiously to, defend these conservative values. And that's what I did also for my master's thesis, except looking at an artist who, instead of, paintings that show the rawness of violence, created images that were abstract and geometric and about bringing calmness and peace to a situation of chaos, a moment where non-figural art, right, nothing recognizable in an image, the idea that you can bring a kind of meditative peacefulness to people through that experience. And so for me, art has a way of connecting and deeply expressing a desire for change, not just an expression of the culture in which people are raised, but also a deep desire for an audience to change the nature of themselves as they see the work and question themselves, their identities, their deep outlook, and maybe find a different way. And these two artists, Obregón and Ramírez Villamizar, did the opposite thing. One was about, the bloody cross of Christ, where literally dripping in blood, kind of manifestation of the suffering on the cross as a speaking of redemption, right, of sacrifice, versus an abstraction, maybe just a cross that says, we're going for the peaceful side, right? The message isn't about, suffering. Suffering is there, but it's also about hope and love, and we're going to create this calm and peaceful environment surrounding us. And how do we change the environment within which we exist so that we can create that better world for everybody, right? For a society that needs desperately change. And so we have that kind of a construction that seeks change at a very fundamental level. And it's interesting, both were raised Catholic. Colombia is a Catholic nation. Up until the 80s, it had an actual official relationship with the Vatican. It's called the Concordat. And so there were lots of limitations in relationship to that. And I do have my phone off, but for some reason, I haven't gotten the notifications off. It clicks on all sorts of other things. So I apologize. And so Ramírez Villamizar, the abstract, we're going to bring peace to the nation through art. His faith journey took him towards atheism. He ended up believing that faith was too damaging to the society. And I interviewed him towards the end of his life, and he said, you know what, if there's an earthquake, I'm going to get down on my knees and pray, because that's what I was trained to do. And in a moment of fear, that's what I'll do. But I don't actually believe in something beyond, right? This idea of a cultural embedded kind of a practice that might be manifest. The period that I studied, that era, was emotionally really rough. It's an era that has photography. The photographs that I was having to look at as I was analyzing the time period, and the visual culture, material culture that the artists were having to confront in their process of creating their works, it was spiritually taxing, right? It was mutilated bodies. It was a history that was deeply, deeply troubling. And while I was in graduate school, I started having this situation where my courses on Latin American art were happening against my courses on medieval art. And of course, I could have chosen anything, but I've always been attracted to the Middle Ages. And I find myself delving into the medieval, and then at the last minute trying to pull together that paper for the Latin American art class. And I realized that really that was the area that I wanted to dedicate myself to. And I wanted to dedicate it to Spain, and Portugal, Iberia, where there's this intermixing of religion and culture, right? Spain has a contested history of the Mediterranean that includes, well, pre-Abrahamic faiths, right, on the peninsula, but then a rise of Christianity that happens pretty quickly. And then in the 8th century, you have forces of the Umayyads coming into the peninsula and settling there, in a 700-year history of political and religious authority on the peninsula that was Muslim and not Christian, and the battles that happened within, and a strong Jewish population that grows and in some ways flourishes as a result of a very ecumenical and open view within the Muslim community of people of the book that included Christians and Jews within it. And so you have this kind of flourishing. But what I ended up studying was monasteries. Monasteries built by women, inhabited by women, ones that were incredibly powerful. They ran their communities. One of the kingdoms that I study, the abbess of Las Huelgas, was only the second most powerful woman in the nation. Only the queen was more powerful. She had monies beyond what anybody could imagine, right? These were incredibly powerful women who may not have stood at the front of an army, but actually commanded armies, right? You have that kind of power that becomes possible. And so I moved from staring at images of mutilated bodies to spending time looking at contemplative spaces built for women to lead their lives in prayer, and that have continuity until the present. And so the communities that I studied for my dissertation, one has had continuous habitation since it was founded in 1183. It's a Cistercian monastery in Castilla. And the other one was bombed in the Spanish Civil War. It was burned. It wasn't actually bombed. But it was put on fire and destroyed. And the nuns still managed to make its way for a little bit longer. And then in the 1980s, finally gave the community to another religious community. And so it's also had continuous living there. It's just not the same community that has. And so I spend a lot of my time actually visiting monasteries, not just in Spain, but across the Mediterranean world, and thinking about the role of contemplative life in a community. And so in Barcelona, I often stay there. Some of the monasteries, one of their core values is hospitality. So many of them have retreat houses. And one of them in Barcelona, it's a Benedictine house. And what they've ended up doing is becoming, in essence, a dorm for college students. And so they have a space for students to come and to be present at the different hours of prayer during the day, if students want, but of course they don't have to either. So there's no rule that you have to engage with that at all, but it does mean that you're within the community. And it became clear to me what I'd seen in the other contemplative communities, which is these are women who are deeply connected with the world. They didn't move into these walled spaces and shut off the world. And so every time I've been at the one in Barcelona, they've had prayer sessions on the victims of torture. They've had prayer sessions on people who are undocumented, and they've had prayer sessions on different, peace for the rest of the world, a sense that the role of prayer in the world is powerful and tangible. And even if it might be happening in this space separated from the world, although it's literally in the middle of Barcelona, separated from the world, that still is so they don't perceive themselves as passive. They perceive themselves as active, even if they're not teaching and nursing and, you know, those things. I mean, they often have hospitals, but that's not their core charisma of the community. But I also had the experience, and this was in Montserrat in Spain, which has been a pilgrimage site since the 9th century. It's a fascinating site. And, you know, sitting there and the reality that a spiritual journey, relationship with the divine, however that divine is construed, is not dependent on a profession. And this was a moment where I had a couple of nuns who were serving at the University Catholic Center, which is the church that I went to in graduate school in Austin, were inviting me to retreats and were saying, is it possible that you might have a calling to become a nun? The reality of, you know, our profession is not the core, that you need to have a relationship, right? With the divine, with God, however you define it. That is not about a career. It's about the time, the relationship that you build, the prayer, the community you form, how you act in the world. And that those thoughts were what were running in my mind in this community that is incredibly powerful. That one's not a women's foundation. There's one just down the road, but it's the one that has the massive retreat house. And they have deep roots in a community that was Muslim. They survived as a major pilgrimage site. There are images of the Black Virgin of Montserrat all over Latin America, all over Europe. They were destroyed in the 19th century. And so the medieval church doesn't survive anymore, but the community survived. And during the era of Franco, after the Spanish Civil War, where Catalan was a forbidden language, it couldn't be used, people couldn't dance their traditional dances from Catalunya, publications, right, no legal documents, no publications. They were changing the names of roads into Spanish from Catalan. They were changing tombstones, changing them from Jordi to Jorge, right? So you have this aggression, but the Franco government was very pro-Catholic. And so these monks basically refused to publish in anything but Catalan. And so anti-clerical people in Catalonia will still protect this community because they stood firm in their cultural norms and continued to speak and publish and everything. And so it's the role of a community that stands up and says, no, you can't, we won't be moved here, is one that is incredibly powerful to me. And so that's where I've continued my journey. But here I teach both medieval and also modern global South. And so when I go back to teaching after I finish my stint as associate provost, I teach on clearly Latin America and the Middle Ages, but also I have a course on Africa, a course on India. And so there's also that kind of a construction. So I think I'll leave it there. And what questions do you have for me?
I just have one. Yeah, it seems like you have researched a lot, learned a lot about different cultures and other aspects of different people. How do you tie that into your personal, I guess, connection with God? Like, how does that intertwine with each other?
I think in many ways, I feel that my faith and my connection is extended to how I work in the world. And so I try to extend myself outward in a way that honors my faith, but isn't a sledgehammer. And I'm not trying to change people. I'm just trying to be present and and for lack of a better word, good, right? Kind, generous where I can. I think the idea of a beloved community is a really powerful one, and I think that is how we manifest our faith in the world more than our words. And so the pandemic has meant that I'm one of those people whose stress levels about the pandemic are pretty high. My mother's 85. If something happens and she needs to be cared for, I need to be able to get on a plane tomorrow. So I have to be very cautious. One of us has to be able to do that. And I don't have children, so I don't have those risks. And so it means I haven't been doing my regular church going practice. But I do those things. When I'm nervous, as Ramidas Villamizar, getting on in a moment, I have the prayers I was taught as a child that are regular part of my life. I wake up in the morning and I think about the day ahead and what I can do. In small ways and in bigger ways, I think we're manifest more in our actions than in our speech, and so I try to do that in my world. Yeah.
Thank you.
I have a question. So you mentioned a lot of places and research that you have been or like just explored. So what spiritual practices did you pick up along the way that you weren't initially taught as a child?
It's interesting. I don't use the language of meditation. My mother learned Transcendental Meditation in the early 60s and meditates twice a day, I think almost to the present. She certainly does the morning one. And so I tend to associate with very particular kind of behavior. But I think contemplative practice is something that I developed over time. And I have to say, the Hail Mary is one that I have memories of. I had my grandmother's eldest brother had a very long convalescence, and his sisters, who had never married, ended up taking care of him when his daughter, there were death threats, she had to leave the country. I won't get into the complexities of my family in Colombia, but his sisters took care of him until the end of his life, and he couldn't move from the bed, and so he would end up, he was very frail. And every night there were people who came, women from their community who came and did the full rosary every single night around his bed for 10 years, right? This wasn't you come once a week or once a month. No, it was every single night. They went through the process of saying the rosary with him there, and he really couldn't speak. But like I said, it's a very devout Catholic family and conservative in its approach to the world. And that kind of caring, I think, is really, I don't remember my mother teaching me the rosary, is I guess what I would say, but that kind of meditative, right, the repetitiveness of the prayer, right, over and over, I think has a meditative component that I've discovered to be very powerful. And I see that kind of meditative repetitiveness in, for example, the prayer beads that within the Islamic community are used, where there are 100 names of God, right? And so you go through them, that kind of stopping whatever else is going on around you and taking a moment and just being, and being in a prayerful place. It doesn't even have to be a prayerful place. I knew a friend who did them in the subway. She was dealing with a lot of grieving, and so she had that constancy. You can do them anywhere, but it does mean that you're moving your brain away from everything else, all the chaos, and that kind of repetitiveness helps you calm that stress And I think that is a useful tool in however it's manifest, right? Transcendental meditation, it's not a prayer, it's a word that's said over and over and over again. And so I think that is one of the things that I wasn't really trained in as a child. And I will say my father died when I was very young, and my mother was very angry with him for dying, with the divine for taking him. And so we had a period of separation from the church. And so it meant coming back. And as an adult, I mean, so you sort of reconnecting. And I think that was meaningful. But, that I find in physical spaces, there's a church called San Miniato in central Italy. I taught in Italy for a semester. And I remember going into this, again, it was a monastic church. I was with 27 students, college students your age. And usually there was a lot of activity going on as they were supposed to be looking at the architecture. And the students walked in and they all sat down quietly. They walked around quietly. There was a sort of peacefulness in that site. And I find that in a lot of different pilgrimage sites in particular, but not in the central hall where everybody's gathering, but there's often a chapel or another place within that space that not everybody goes to, but you sit down and it's like there's peace there, a calmness. And I find that in lots of different places of many different faiths, where you can find that quiet. And often it's to the side of a place of tremendous fanfare, right? Pilgrimage sites have massive amounts of people that come at different times of year. And then you find that little, temple, chapel, synagogue that's off to the corner. And if you need to get away, right, from the busyness, that there's that space that you can do it. I find those kinds of spaces really powerful.
Thank you.
Other questions?
I don't have a question. I just have a comment. I think it's so important. I think that the contemplative, practices, that repetitiveness that you mentioned, that can bring calmness, that is so meaningful, but it's so individual because it can be rote. I think it really can be rote, if it has no meaning for you. But I think it's so valuable. And I love the Labyrinth for that, because for me, a Labyrinth, I've done several, not just the ones at Berea, but, do them when I can. There's always a thought that is alternating with each step as I do the Labyrinth. So there's a lot of ways for that. And it's meaningful to me, but I do think I come more from a background where that kind of thing is considered, rote and not meaningful. And I think that's so not true, so much not true.
And those kinds of, it's interesting, the idea of circumambulation, of moving around, right? It's present in so many different traditions. And the Labyrinth, the one we usually use that I see here is usually the one from Chartres, which was meant to be a pilgrimage, right? If you couldn't get to the Holy Land, you couldn't get to Rome, it was a spiritual pilgrimage that you walked and you prayerfully went through. And I agree, not everybody understands that. And there's an artist, Richard Serra, who tried to create that in 3 dimensions, and he created, it wasn't the Labyrinth plan, right? He wasn't that deliberate, but he created these massive barriers, right, on either side of you. You can't look over them, and you walk through the space. But because he's famous and it was in this massive museum, you had to wait in line, and you walked with people in front and behind. It completely altered what was meant to be a personal experience, became the sort of collective. And I remember that a lot because I found that incredibly moving, right? I went through that space and I all of that history of a contemplative pilgrimage within that kind of circumambulation, all of that was present for me. And some friends, we were at a dinner, and they were talking about, this happened to be in Bilbao in Spain, and at the Guggenheim, and these friends of my mother's were mocking it. And I said, well, can let me tell you what that was actually meant to be. And they just weren't even willing. It was just yet another example of how modern art is vacuous and meaningless. And I was like, no. And then I realized that that's where they were. They weren't interested in hearing me tell them about this spiritual past of this kind of a practice. And I think that's also an aspect of it, is are you willing to listen, right? To hear what people are exploring. And so my brother, for example, this isn't, my journey has not been his, but we go to museums and he asks me fabulous questions and he listens deeply, and even to the spiritual kinds of aspects. I dragged him around Italy and we went to Siena. I wanted to see the home of St. Catherine of Siena. And we were playing one of those 20 question games. And we got into one question. It was, is it a person? And I thought he'd enjoyed this trip with me. And he said, oh, I bet it's that saint she dragged me to. And I was like, oh my God, I didn't know that I'd done that to my poor brother. But he, in the moment, he was very willing for me to take him to see all sorts of random things he would not have gone to otherwise, without me saying, and we're going to go see, the image of Saint Teresa of Avila that's made by Bernini in Rome, right? And I just, the way, if you think about the history of art and how artists have tried to make visible what is a deeply intimate relationship, right? Particularly a mystical experience where nobody else witnesses it. How do you make that manifest? It's actually a kind of fascinating thing to think about, how different cultures try to make that present to the world as an example, right, of what is possible, and in many ways explore their own spirituality through the process of creating an object of that kind. But they're often commissioned. Yeah. And I know I took us on a tangent, but there you go.
No, Eileen, I would love to travel with you. I have learned so much today, and this has been just so exciting for me. So I'm going to try to condense I have many questions, but I think I've narrowed it down. So I love contemplative practice, both individual and communal. And I really learned this, even though I identify in, what's the so-called Protestant traditions of Christianity. I lived in a convent in Castilla León in Ponferrada,
Wow.
and living in community with the Sisters of the Assumption. That individual and communal contemplative practice just became part of the fabric of who I am, which is really strange, in many ways for, at least in this nation, for one who identifies in, those so-called Protestant traditions. And so I'm struck by my experience with that contemplative practice in a community of women who were spiritual mothers, but not mothers in the biological sense. And given that children of the book have interpreted mothering biologically with women's identity, I think, in so many ways. And I don't have biological children, and you mentioned that you don't have children either. I was just wondering if throughout your journey, you've done any contemplation about that specific area of our spirituality as women, and how you know, we as women who don't have biological children also have a wholeness and a peace and a spirituality and mothering that is often not really heralded in, you know, the traditions, specifically of the children of the book.
It is, and coming from Latin America, the question I always had, no matter what age I am, is who am I married to? Oh, well then who are you dating? Oh, then, you know, it's just kind of, and it often has to do with me traveling alone and this idea that I must have gotten permission from somebody to travel by myself. You know, who's supposed to be chaperoning you, right? It is culturally an aspect that we contend with, right? I would have been very happy to be a mother. I love kids. I love my nephews. I play with the babies. I'm willing to change diaper, right? None of those things bothered me. It wasn't the journey I took, though. In my family, though, I mentioned my great aunts. So my grandmother was one of 13, and 4 of them were women. She was the only one who married. My great grandmother believed that marriage was a kind of slavery, and being a slave to the church was just worse. Right? So it's better to depend on your siblings. That was kind of, and you know, she had 13 kids, and then her husband, you know, fell off a house and left her with a 9-month-old, and you know, all the, you know, and had moved her far, far away from where her family was and her support system was. I completely get her point of view. But those 3 women were the core of that family. There was a role for aunts. There was a role for the single woman who is there when everything else is falling apart. And so they're the ones who took care of people who were sick. They're the ones who intervened when there were struggles between siblings. They're, you know, they were very active with the church, but they were also just the space. And you imagine if there's, you know, 9 of them married, the youngest son never married, but 9 children in an era anti-contraceptives, that there are a lot of babies in my family. My mother had something like 50 cousins. You know, they gathered at their house every Sunday if they were around. And so that sense of community built around single women who don't have children of their own, but seem to be caretakers of everybody else's, was something that was part of the worldview that I was given, right? That there was an expectation of marriage, but there was still a role for you if you weren't. And I think that sometimes we negate that. And in some ways, nuns have always been that, right? Sometimes not by choice. When you leave your 1-year-old or 6-month-old at the monastery to become a nun, that's probably not her choice, or his choice in the case of young men, but it often was a choice, and it was a choice that particularly pre-modern era probably meant that you were going to live longer, right? One of the most dangerous things for women is childbirth, but it also allowed them independence. It allowed them a life of the mind. It allowed them a role in a community that, had they not married, they would have simply been seen as dependents. And so I think within the tradition I was raised, there is a space for that kind of experience. And I appreciate that, right? Benefited from it. And I love being an aunt. I have 2 nephews and a niece, and I look forward to seeing them grow into just amazing human people, adults in the future. They're still very young, and I don't get to see them as often as I would, because I live in Kentucky and they're in Austin, Texas, and Long Beach, California. So they're very far away. But, you know, I've always had people in my community with kids as well. And I just think that there is such diversity possible of human experience. And this is one of those that has a really powerful role. And I actually listened to, I'm not sure it was a TED Talk, but something like a TED Talk. And it was talking about the situation of and fighting against the language of childless, right? A single woman who's not raising children of their own, and talking about the economic benefit to families of having that single woman who has chosen, or by default fallen into that situation for natural reasons, biological reasons, that there's actually a financial benefit to having someone like that in the family. The statistics are out there of that role. And so there was a lot of pressure to take a different path than I did. But I don't regret the choices I've made. I think I've made choices that were good for me at the moment, and they've led me to a space where I feel fulfilled in what I do and in my relationships. And so I'm good. And I just think it's a different path. There are so many paths that we can take.
Beautiful. Well, I echo that sentiment, and I just want to thank you for spending time with us today. I am better because you said yes, and the conversation has just been so rich. And so thank you so very much. So I want to be mindful of time. I know there are probably many more questions stirring in our hearts, but we are fortunate to have Dr. McKiernan González as part of our family here at Berea, and we can always reach out, right? So could we just have a round of applause for her?
Thank you. And thank you for making me stretch myself.
Thank you for being willing to stretch. All right, everyone, have a good afternoon, and thanks for joining us for Seekers today.